It's rare that you get to have a brush with history, but that's what I was privileged to do when I was able to virtually sit down and have a conversation with Professor Joyce Malcolm. For those of you who somehow do not know who she is, it would not be an overstatement to say that we owe so much of our knowledge of the Second Amendment and consequently of the Bruen court decision that has founded and created the history and tradition test in no small part to her academic work. Professor Joyce Malcolm from George Mason University, she didn't start doing research in the history of weapons laws and militias laws and so forth. She invented that type of research and history, without whom we may not have any of this. I have read her book twice, To Keep and Bear Arms, a foundational work in this area of literature and research, first published in 1994. And for those people who consider themselves serious Second Amendment scholars or enthusiasts, she is one of the most preeminent scholars and researchers for you to become familiar with. In the description box and in the pinned comment below, you will find a couple links to her work, both the seminal work, To Keep and Bear Arms, as well as her book that she just recently published. I encourage you both, please take a moment to check that out. Professor Malcolm has graciously allowed us to talk about today, where did some of the origins of the right to keep and bear arms come from, some of the early English militia laws. And our discussion today goes up through basically the English Bill of Rights from the 1680s. In future discussions, I hope to expand on that if you all, of course, like this sort of thing, and sit down with her again to basically cover more eras of history. So don't forget to, of course, like the video, post comments and questions down below. And without further ado, let's talk to Professor Malcolm. Guys, let's get into it. Professor Joyce Malcolm, we really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So take it away. Where do we start in this journey?
I guess we start, as they used to say in history, from time out of mind. From very ancient times, Englishmen have been required, actually, it was a duty to be armed to protect themselves, to protect their families, to protect their community, to be in a militia. So it goes back very far. But one of the other things that I think it's important to mention, and we can pick it up later, is that along with allowing people and actually insisting that they protect themselves, there was a real hostility to professional soldiers and mercenaries. And there were mercenaries from way back. So from the time of Magna Carta, 1215, one of the promises that King John had to make was to send the mercenaries he had back to Europe. People really were worried about professional military, that they were cruel, that they were people that didn't understand the neighborhood. They wanted to keep enforcement in local hands. And so I think that part of that ancient story about the militia comes from the idea that you're much safer if it's you and your neighbors who are keeping the peace than if it's foreign hired people who are basically hired because they don't know you, and so they feel no affiliation with the neighborhood, and I think that's really the origins of the militia. But I can also get into all of the many duties, and I think one of the things to remember is that for a very long time, being armed and having a lot of peacekeeping duties were duties. This was not a right, it was a duty. And people thought of it as a duty. And if you didn't carry it out, you could be fined and punished. So there were a whole series of things. You were supposed to, if a crime had been committed, follow the hue and cry of the sheriff and go with your weapon to capture whoever it was who had done something wrong. If something occurred in your neighborhood, somebody was harmed or robbed, your neighborhood had to reimburse that person. So it was a real incentive to keep the peace. You had a right and a duty to protect yourself and your neighbors. You could get your neighbors together to protect your house. If you actually shot and injured anybody who was assaulting your house, that wasn't a felony, that was perfectly fine. you had a right and a duty, mostly a duty, I should say, to take turns keeping watch at night and ward during the day in your village. So there were, and then there was this duty for the militia, and it was a huge scope. First, it was, I think, all of the able-bodied men from 16 to 60, which is a real mob. And then eventually, over the years, it got narrowed to people of, sort of the middle age who were likely to be more effective. But the militia always, as it developed, had this local aspect to it, that it was like a local defense force. They couldn't make you go abroad. And in some cases, the local militia didn't even want to leave their county. They were there to protect their families. If they were taken out of their county, who was there to protect the families? So it always had that very local sense, and it was led by local nobles or important people. And they liked the idea of keeping this power of the sword in local hands and not letting a monarch have that power. And one of the things that made this more and more important was that during the late 15th, 16th century, the European powers, kings, started to have these large professional armies. And as they had these large armies and their legislatures were required to pay for it, local people were taxed to pay for these expensive military. Those military were often used to suppress the local people, as a lot of militaries in the world today are. A lot of countries are not under any kind of threat, but they have this military that really keeps the peace according to whatever the ruler wants. So there was a lot of resentment and worry about any king who wanted to have that kind of a military, that it would end up suppressing the people, and Parliament was always very, very reluctant to vote funds for such a military, preferring that they rely on the militia, even though the militia could be unsatisfactory, because if there was a riot going on in their local area and the militia sympathized with rioters, they weren't about to suppress them. So it had this kind of double-sided.
It was a built-in check on the power structure in a very real sense by that.
Oh, yes, it was. It was. I mean, from the time of Magna Carta on. I mean, and the local nobles and the local power structure did not want to give that up to the crown. And since once Parliament was required to vote funds for the nation and vote funds for a military, which was always expensive, they were very careful to only vote funds if there was a war. They did not want a standing army, as they called it, in time of peace. They did not want a military funded by and working for the crown in peacetime. And so they would refuse to vote the funds for that. Very wise of them, I think. But it was an aggravation for the kings, actually. And if there was a foreign war, the militia had no obligation to go. So the king would have to get the money to finance the foreign war and recruit people to go there, to go to Europe or go to Scotland or somewhere like that. So it hampered the crown, but it did mean that the local people, and I should say they didn't always like serving in the militia, it was dangerous, it was a bother, but it meant that the local establishment had control of the power of the sword, even though local people, and that was really rare that this was the case, local people had weapons. They were required to have a certain amount of weapons. They were required to practice with them. And early on, the weapons that you were to have were bows and arrows, particularly the longbow, which was a great weapon that the English had triumphed with. And then gradually, as firearms came in, they gave up the requirement that you practice with a longbow, and you were to practice with a handgun. But I should say that they were very careful about that. And ordinary individuals could not have a gun that had a barrel less than a yard long. So you can imagine the size of that. They had these large weapons that they were required to practice with on Sundays and other times convenient. And there were some restrictions. There was worry that these would be misused, and particularly worried about really small guns or crossbows. And there were laws against carrying these because they could be concealed. Sort of ironic now, because people are happier with concealed weapons and seeing all weapons carried openly. But in those days, it was the robbers, the highway robbers and others who were using the concealed weapons. So the law was only against that. There are a lot of historians who have misinterpreted that to say ordinary people could have guns. They were required to have them, but they were long guns with a barrel that was at least a yard long.
I know from going through your book, I recall that you cited a law in there saying that every English boy upon turning the age of 7 was required to be furnished with a bow and 2 arrows for practice. And I think that, recalling from your book, the very first year that at least I found was 1252, was when people were ordered to be armed, and that was later consolidated in 1285. So both, of course, in the wake of the Magna Carta, by the Statute of Winchester, King Edward I, saying everybody needs to be armed. So when you reference that this wasn't some sort of novel 16th century creation or something like that from the perspective of the time, this went back hundreds and hundreds. I mean, that's the same distance from 16th, 17th century England to Magna Carta England as we are from 16th, 17th century England.
Yeah, it was really ancient. I should say there was an advantage to the monarch because this was cheap, was a whole lot cheaper than hiring people. And it was a local way of keeping order and ensuring that there was, sort of a peaceable country. There was no police force in Britain until the 19th century, and no standing army until the 17th century. And I should add just one little tidbit about the standing army. When they got a professional army, they felt that they needed it because of wars going on in Europe and so forth. Parliament was really very cautious about it. And the army had a militia act where the army had to come back to Parliament every year to get funding. And it had its own series of rules, but they could not charge anybody with mutiny or desertion unless they got this approval every year. So funding every year, the right to be able to punish the soldiers every year. Every year they came back to Parliament until after World War I. So it just shows you how long there was this tradition that you had to be very careful that it was the civilians that controlled the military, and that these professional standing soldiers did not take either work for the government, the crown, or take matters into their own hands. Even if they committed a crime, they had to go before a common law court. They couldn't go before a military court martial because they wanted them to be under the same rules as ordinary people. So there's a whole lot of devices that were meant to keep the military under control. I mean, there's sometimes you would think, oh, well, I wish the generals had more power here than the president. But the idea was that you wanted the military to be under civilian control. So as we've gotten bigger and bigger military, it still has to come back to the legislature for its budget. And during the Constitutional Convention, one of the changes that was discussed and made was that the American Army would not have to come back every year. It could come back every 2 years. And there was a lot of concern about that this would not give the Congress enough control. But the reason they did it was that they said, well, the representatives are elected every 2 years, so every 2 years seems fine. And so that's what we have.
Interesting. And it's interesting to see the organic development across the tapestry of English history. of really what turned out to be a de facto power sharing relationship between, on the one hand, individuals like you and me who were armed and could choose to side with the rioters if they believed that the rioters were correct. And then at another part, of course, you had the nobility, the aristocracy, the folks who more or less straddled the line between the common folk and then the king on the other hand, right? And they all had to be aligned in order to make this system work. Is that a fair outlook on this?
Yes, yes, it is. And they each had an agenda here, something that was in it for them. So that the nobility, who always sort of saw themselves as straddling the line between the monarch and the people, really wanted to keep that control and that local power. There was always worry that obviously that the people who were armed, and not only armed but trained in arms, they had to be trained to use them, could riot and use them in harmful ways. And there were a lot of restrictions on hunting, because it was one thing to be showing up for militia musters and, you know, putting down riots. And it was another thing to be out hunting in the woods, where you could have an accident with your gun and maybe the local landlord got shot. So they were much more, they passed a series of game acts that forbid people to, ordinary folk who had less than a certain amount of income or land, to use their guns for hunting. But as I track in the book, when they tried to use that to actually take weapons from people, it didn't work. But that there still is that cachet about hunting. And on Boxing Day, which is the day after Christmas, celebrated in Britain, is the great day for the hunt. And they all go out to hunt fox. And there is this tradition that it's the upper class that hunts. Not always really true anymore, but there was, this is what the wealthier people did as an enjoyment. That's one of the reasons that the Labour Party has tried to stop fox hunting, was this sort of resentment that this was, you know, an elite privileged occupation.
Right. And of course, you're referencing, I think it was the 1681 Game Act, which made it illegal for many Englishmen to keep arms. We've got this trajectory, which starts back really at the Magna Carta. And then, of course, we've got early 13th century, 1215, if I'm not mistaken, from memory. And then we go to 1252. Now Englishmen have a duty to be armed. And then this evolved into bands, and then later so-called trained bands, i.e., sure, all men in England between 16 and 60 are part of this unorganized militia, so to speak. But as far as the enforcement of the laws, which made it so that people actually have to train, difficult to lock up or fine an entire population. So let's focus in on these trained bands, these people who are really at the end of the day, if something is going to go wrong, these are the people who are going to get the call, so to speak. And then, of course, we get these laws that, well, let me pause it there. Any reaction or any thoughts about what I just kind of threw out there on the table?
No, that's fine. I think we need to point out too that it's after the end of the reign of James II, where he tries to get rid of the militia and build up an army, and you have William and Mary coming in, that the English draft their Bill of Rights, Declaration of Rights, and then becomes a Bill of Rights 100 years before our Bill of Rights. And in that, for the first time, they say that there's a right to be armed. It has a lot, and the way they express it had nothing to do with the militia. Actually, it was a personal right, but it had certain restrictions on it. It was the subjects which are Protestant, because they worried Catholics had been asked by the Pope to overthrow the Protestant monarchy. So subjects which are Protestant may have arms for their defense, suitable to their condition and as allowed by law. So it was a religious right, but something like 90% of the people at that time were Protestant. And suitable to their condition was their status. So if you travel around Britain today and go into some of these wonderful country houses, they have weapons in beautiful design on the walls, circles of long guns and everything. If you were wealthy, that was fine. If you were, a poor person and you were amassing a large number of weapons, there was this fear that you had something bad in mind. So that was suitable to their condition. And then allowed by law left an opening for legal restrictions. And it's only over the rest of that century and into the, to the early 1800s and that it becomes a right without those restrictions, that everybody has the right. It isn't a question of your status. It isn't a question of your religion. The law says you can have a gun to protect yourself and carry it around. And so that takes, it gradually evolves to eliminate those restrictions. And of course, the Second Amendment doesn't have anything like those restrictions.
Right. A lot of the early gun control, for lack of a better way of putting it, that I read from your book, which I highly recommend to any of the viewers out there, linked in the description box and comment field below. It seemed like a lot of the weapon control, because of course we're still dealing with arrows and all that kind of stuff, really kind of came down to a couple different spots. One of those spots dealt with the so-called game laws, which from your book, from my recollection at least of your book, dealt with a lot of the nobility trying to maybe inoculate themselves from accidental hunting issues like you brought up, but also basically to preserve the game for them. And that was something that they viewed very much as their right and perhaps their exclusive right to have access to the game. And I remember from your book, one of the various uprisings against the nobility, the common people, basically as an act of open rebellion, went through and slaughtered all the game animals in a particular forest, basically as just kind of an open gesture of, probably lots of things actually happening at once. So we've got the game laws on the one hand. We've got the anti-Catholic laws on the other, of examining Catholics who are armed, and this power struggle, depending upon whether or not the monarch was Protestant or Catholic, of which group, who's in power, and then who are we disarming, right? And then on the third hand, we then have the king doing things like monopolizing the manufacture and control of gunpowder, requiring registration, which was truly not really, it was on the books, but it wasn't practiced or enforced, except maybe in the slightest degree. I just threw a lot of things out at you. I don't know what you want to react to there. But those were some things that I recall from reading your book in this era of history that really basically stood out to me.
Yes, I think when you talk about the Game Acts, there's a distinction that we sometimes forget between a law that's on the books and what it's actually enforced or not. And I think that a lot of the game laws, which included, you're not having certain kind of dogs and you're not having nets to trap with game and all of that, were supposed to be enforced by gamekeepers on someone's estate. And basically they tended to be used as a kind of lever, we could enforce them, we don't, if you don't behave. There was all kinds of poaching. Local inns would be serving poached rabbits and pheasants and other things. So they're laws that can be used, but are frequently not enforced. And I did try very hard to find out whether some of these things were being enforced. But even more important in some senses, that the guns were eliminated from the list of prohibited objects from these game acts, because as somebody in prominent said, a gun is useful for a farmer to shoot crows, and it can't be considered as as inconvenient and illegal. So they sort of separated out the practical, but to just sort of jump ahead, um, but between a law that you might want on the books and whether it's going to be enforced, several states have tried to outlaw certain kinds of guns. And if you own them, it's a felony. But the sheriffs and the local law enforcement people do not want to enforce those. And the local people who have those guns are not about to hand them in. So you can have a law, but you also need to be able to enforce it. And if the people that are doing that enforcing don't want to do it, it can't happen.
All right, and you were citing examples of that as early as 1553, as I recall, where the king ordered people to give their names to local justices if they were in possession of firearms. And then when a new sheriff or someone like that was appointed, they were to basically come in and check that out. But oftentimes one of the first things that whoever the local official was when they came to town, they would basically ask from your book, hey, I know this is the law, but like, are we really doing this here? And quite often the answer was no. And they would just accept it and move on.
Yeah, I found that often someone had disobeyed several laws at once before they finally got prosecuted, out on a Sunday, shooting game in someone else's yard with a shotgun, which shot was dangerous. And so it was legal. So he committed 3 crimes before they finally decided that maybe this is enough, So there was a lot more tolerance and flexibility than you would get a sense of if you were just reading the statutes. But at the end of the day, the right to be armed and to carry a weapon became a right, that real right for most of the people. And even if there was someone like with this guy who had committed all these offenses by shooting the game on a Sunday and someone else's property, he would be fined and couldn't use a gun for a certain number of years. But they never would say that's it for life, If there was a real sense that this was something that you needed for your personal self-defense. And even when there were laws, when Catholics were still being restricted about the weapons they could have, they were always allowed to have personal weapons for their own defense. So that's so basic that you have to be able to protect yourself and your family, even if you shouldn't be amassing weapons to, overthrow the government.
So I want to return to something that we touched on here. So there's this underlying current, right, of this power sharing dynamic between the people at one end, the king on the other, the nobility, which can be wishy-washy depending upon the issue and presumably what their interests are. How common was it? And as a historian who professionally is in this place at this time, do you have a sense of how common was it for the king to pass a law and for one or both of the nobility or the people just to kind of shrug it off and just utterly ignore it or unenforce it, whether universally across England or in large swaths across England? Was this unique to weapons law, or was this much more common than maybe people realize?
I think it was more common. I mean, one of the indications that something is not being enforced is if the same or a similar law is passed several times. If it worked the first time, it's like, nobody should go over 55 miles an hour on our highways. And that never worked. I mean, so it's so easy, particularly for someone studying law, to assume that once that law's in effect, everybody is obeying it. And you realize that, the fact that it has to be reiterated time and again means that it is simply not working. So it isn't just weapons, it's, other things that sort of stand in the way of the normal give and take of life that, just as one example, and this is not so much a law, but during the English Civil War, where the king and parliament were fighting each other.
So 1640s, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes. Okay. Excellent. During the 1640s, the king would, my dissertation was on who was fighting for the king and what the rules were. At any rate, he would summon the militia to come with their best weapons. And then his idea was to take their best weapons and give it to his army. Well, after he had done this once or twice, the militia knew this was not a good idea. So as one of them said, we will appear when the king says it, but our best weapons will stay at home. So sometimes even, these direct orders were quietly evaded. I mean, people have always been, ordinary human beings that are not little automatons that are going to do what they're told. And the thing about the right to be armed and what makes it such an emotional, important right is it's so personal. It's so important. It's your life. And so people are going to be real careful about any restrictions on it. And I think that always has been the case.
Back during this time period, did people view, and I suspect I know the answer, but people don't want to hear my version of it. They want to hear your version of it.
You seem you've studied the book, so
I wasn't lying when I said that I'm a big fan of yours. I've watched your talks, and no, this is I double majored in theology and medieval European history, which means that this is light reading by my standards to go through this.
Something about theology, and they'll let go, and that is that one of the reasons for self-defense is that people are created in the image of God. And so you have a right to protect that image. Okay.
Right. There's something divine to each of us, which perhaps is one of the anchoring reasons why, unique to English-speaking countries, I feel like we are uniquely centered on the individual as compared to the community in a lot of very real ways. And there are a few places where that is more manifest than in discussions based around right to expression, right to free speech, right to religion, and right to bear arms. And to me, these are truly canary in the coal mine issues of so goes these, so goes so many other things. And these are an index in a very real sense, to my mind, of how we perceive of ourselves, our interaction with one another, our duties and responsibilities to ourselves, to each other, and what's our relationship to each other in the government. So it's among the reasons why I find this so interesting and personal.
It is. It's and this right to self-defense is very personal, and one reason that a lot of governments don't like to allow people to have that scope. In Britain today, they regard self-defense as vigilantism, that you're making yourself judge and jury.
Right.
Think of it that way. We think, so you've got to be able to protect yourself. That is your first, most basic right.
Just a really quick pause. Show your support for the Second Amendment. Show your support for Professor Malcolm. Don't forget to hit that like button. And if you just found us while browsing through, we do videos like this all the time. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss any future content. Now back to the video. Where I was going before was, I think that there's almost a few different sides of the coin of being armed. Why are people armed? Why do people choose to be armed? Or back then, why were people compelled to be armed? We've got one side of the coin as I see it. I'm going to ask you for your reaction of how this existed back then. How did people conceptualize this back then? One side of what we're talking about here, one facet was people's ability to protect themselves, to protect their property, to protect their family, to protect their community from ordinary robbers and that sort of thing. On the other hand, we have the ability to resist tyranny, whether that's coming from the king, from the king's mercenaries, or from the nobility, or wherever else it might be expressed from, but from some sort of presumed authority figure. And then on the third, I was going to say hand, but on our third wing to this is the duty, as it was, to be responsible to serve, to protect the land from foreign invasions. So in order to unite to protect the community. So it seems to me like we've got three different expressions: ordinary thieves, ordinary robbers, ordinary bad guys, a government that turns bad, and on the third hand, a foreign power from coming in. I don't know if, number one, if there was something I'm missing or you want to add to that. And number two is the follow-on, really is the main question. How did people perceive the ability and the right to possess weapons and firearms eventually as it relates to those planks? Did they conceptualize it in the same light? Were they only focused on one or the other? Or how would you look at that?
It's hard to know what people very early on thought about that, because they were so locally centered, and some people never went very far from their local area. But William Blackstone, who wrote about the commentaries on the laws of England, was a great bestseller. The first volume was published in 1765, so it was right before the American Revolution. But he said that that this right to be armed was to protect. It was basically an auxiliary right to protect all our other rights should those be taken away. In other words, this was to make sure that all of our rights were not just as what the founders would call parchment barriers, but we had a right to defend ourselves and to make sure that if the government or anyone ever tried to take away those other rights, we would have a way of making sure that they were preserved. And I think that that kind of ties the whole thing together. It has a local level, but it also has protecting your form of government. And people in Britain early on always liked to say that they were the freest people on earth. An Englishman has all these rights, and particularly as opposed to the French, they said that the French government, the French king can squeeze his people like a sponge, but Englishmen have rights. And this idea that every ordinary Englishman has rights was so important. It was sort of embedded in it, and it connects all these things of your individual right and your right to be armed to protect the other rights, and making sure that the government doesn't intrude on those rights. So they came up with different strategies over the years, but that was, I think, really very much behind the right to be armed and eventually our Second Amendment.
Right, the freest subjects under heaven, as they would like to say, to be guarded and defended from all violence and force by their own arms, kept in their own hands, and used at their own charge under the prince's conduct, I think is page 3 from my notes of your book there. And right, you mentioned of course, William Blackstone. For those people who are neither historians nor have suffered through the indignities of law school, they would not know how important this writer William Blackstone was, who at the time in the 18th century and really beyond was still being cited. Today is still being cited as a source of somebody who basically gathered, consolidated, and then wrote on, here's the status of the law of the land, and here's some history to it, and became such a preeminent figure on this that his views and his way of reconciling issues is treated basically with the force of law. And he wrote on this, he called it, to your point, the fifth last auxiliary right. This is from the introduction in your book, if I'm not mistaken. And he went on to write, is that of having arms for the defense. It is indeed a public allowance under due restrictions of the natural right of resistance and self-preservation, when sanctions of society and laws are found insufficient to restrain the violence of oppression. That's when we have our right, and that's why we need our right to bear arms.
And he's very readable. And
yes,
there's a economist, really, a political scientist, who did a study of all of the writers and scholars who the founders cited. And next to Montesquieu, Blackstone was the most frequently cited. So he had a tremendous impact on the founders of our country.
And every law school and every law school student. So every lawyer has their rebirth, so to speak, into the law, with Blackstone among some other very famous writers. Professor Malcolm, is there anything that you want to add to this discussion? Is there anything we missed or you just want to underline for folks?
There was a clergyman in England during the American Revolution, and he was talking about how there was a country that had been previously connected to ours. And every cottage has 3 books, or 3 items, he says. They have a law book to understand their rights. They have a firearm to protect those rights. And they have a Bible to help them understand what is immoral and what and the proper right. And I thought and then he adds, what can harm such a country?
I think that's a fantastic quote to close on. So we really appreciate you joining us. This has been a tremendous treat for me as somebody who has appreciated your work and has both near and far insofar as reading your book for many and enjoying it for many, many years. And of course, you've authored many works, and you just recently published a new book. Do you want to share that with the audience?
It's The Times That Try Men's Souls, and it's about families during the time of the American Revolution who were divided in their opinion and what happened to them, and that it truly was in many respects a civil war. So it was nice trying to get to as close as possible to what it was like living at that time. That's what the object is. And it just came out December 5th. So it's this brand new, hot off the press.
And we've had a few different discussions, you and I now, and both times that subject has come up, and it sounds really interesting to me, and I know I intend to pick up a copy, and I would urge everybody to strongly consider doing the same. So again, Professor Malcolm, we really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it thoroughly. You know so much about my book. I was flattered. Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a pleasure.
Hope you all enjoyed that conversation with Professor Malcolm at least half as much as I did, and hope you all got something out of it as well. Be sure to help us out with the algorithm and help us bring her back by posting up your comments, feedback, reactions below. Don't forget to hit that like button. And of course, now let's close with our quote of the day. This one comes from James Monroe. The right of self-defense never ceases. It is among the most sacred and alike necessary to nations and to individuals. Again, we want to thank Professor Malcolm for coming aboard. We'll see you all in the next video. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this one, please feel free to check out some of our other great content, and we'll see you in the next one.